So talking about buzz from the morning, I think from the political commitment of our keynotes, all the way through to that last panel, I don't know if anyone else was mentally adding up both the excitement on the panel, but the expertise and the reach in terms of dollars, number of consumers, breadth and height of reach, not just breadth of reach in terms of where those people have access. I think it was just incredible to sort of think about where the biodiversity conversation is. So even though Tom said, 10 years behind climate, but just think of the acceleration and speed of the biodiversity conversation. It's just incredibly exciting that we've got that. So in terms of our next session, is one of the key objectives is actually facilitate the investments and basically get the money moving, catalyzing nature markets, overcoming barriers, and accelerating investment opportunities. So what we've got coming very shortly is a panel, and the panel will be chaired by Martin Berg, Chief Investment Officer at Climate Asset Management. He's going to be bringing a couple of people along. But before that, we've got a keynote, and I think our keynote speaker has just arrived. His name is Werner Hoyer. He is president of the European Investment Bank, and also previously held the position of the Minister of State at the Foreign Office in Germany, as well as the former president of the European Liberal Democratic Reform Party as well. So what I'm loving about this agenda at the moment is we're going through the different sectors and getting that variety of opinion. I see some fans in the room, so yeah, keep your jackets off and bear with us. And I think if Werner's in the house or close to, there he is. Perfect. Werner, the floor is yours and the mic's there. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Is that on? Hope so, yeah. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, looking at the world today, at many urgent challenges from the pandemic to the energy and food crisis triggered by Russia's unjustifiable and brutal attack on Ukraine. One might be tempted to think that choosing between tackling these crises and the preservation of nature is a dilemma. I believe, in fact, there should be no trade-offs here, especially if we leverage on the complex connections between biodiversity, climate, development, innovation, and well-being. According to the World Economic Forum, $44 trillion of economic value generation, over half of the world's total GDP, is dependent on nature and the nature-based economy. Forestry, water, oceans, agriculture. This is, so to speak, our natural infrastructure. And it is as important for development as the infrastructure that we build. So preserving and increasing the value of these assets by conserving and restoring nature is not romantics, it is smart economics. It is smart economics because the financial value of nature for individual countries can be higher than that of infrastructure projects. Take, for example, the value of pollination for local agriculture, or the preservation of coral reefs for the fishing industry and tourism. The understanding of this value and the connection between biodiversity, climate, and development led the multilateral development banks to sign the joint statement on nature, people, and planet in Glasgow last year. And over 100 financial institutions and capital market players to sign the Finance for the Biodiversity Pledge. I believe these are important steps as finance can become an enabler for transformation by meeting a huge funding gap. Just in the European Union, the funding gap is estimated at 6 billion euros a year at least. The global shortfall is estimated at $700 billion annually between now and 2030. And public funding and the support of philanthropies is essential. But as is the case for all SDGs, you cannot be successful without the private sector involvement. All the taxpayers' money in the world will not be enough to let us reach the SDGs by 2030. So attracting private finance to nature, no small feat. Ecosystems do not lend themselves to traditional investment vehicles. Nature often requires sizable upfront investments for benefits that accrue over time, diffusely or indirectly, and often in the form of avoided future costs that are not accounted for on balance sheets. In addition, much of the world's precious natural capital is found in some of the most fragile places where conflict, poverty, weak governance can make deploying funds exceptionally challenging. Many carbon-rich and biodiverse landscapes may be in a natural state now, but the protection of these landscapes requires frameworks to reward protection and stewardships in these settings. And we also need innovative mechanisms for financing nature that help capture nature's many value streams, bring new funders to the table, and align incentives. So, ladies and gentlemen, despite the many challenges, investing in nature has never been more necessary, nor has it held such an opportunity. The opportunity lies in the rapid evolution of carbon markets, coupled with innovation in nature finance and technologies to measure and monitor ecosystem services. Investors, donors, and communities are learning more and more about the potential business case for nature and its potential impact. At the European Investment Bank, the EU Climate Bank, we mainstream biodiversity in everything we do. We support operations together with local communities to halt and, if necessary, reverse the decline of biodiversity. At the same time, we implement robust environment and social standards that apply to all of our projects globally. We have committed to this exactly 3 years ago when I had the honor to present the energy lending policy of the bank in the General Assembly of the United Nations. We are committed to support nature-positive investments. I would like to mention a very few examples. Recently, one from my own country, Germany. We provided 1.3 billion euros to the colossal restoration program around the Emscher River. You have never heard of it. It's a small river in the industrial Ruhr region, the industrial heartland of Germany, home to almost 10 million people. What once was called the sewer of Germany's industrial heartland has now become a small paradise. Renaturalization. We're not only financing nature investments inside the EU, but nature is a priority outside of the EU as well. For example, we have invested in the Land Degradation Net Neutrality Fund. This is a first-of-its-kind impact investment fund targeting sustainable land use and ecosystem restoration projects in developing countries. This includes support, for instance, building sustainable coffee value chains in Peru, thereby reducing land degradation and increasing forest cover. Another example is our backing of the Eco Enterprise Fund. This is a largely female-run fund that supports indigenous communities to build businesses that enhance and protect the relationship between the forest and the people in countries like Ecuador. And all this while supporting equality, jobs, and leadership opportunities for women. So, ladies and gentlemen, looking forward, financial institutions and the EIB, and I happen to be the chair of the multilateral development banks this year. It goes by rotation, but this year it's us, and we are ambitious. The financial institutions, including EIB, will do their part for nature-based investments as we aim at improving our impact for the preservation of the environment. I'm looking forward to find out with you how we can accelerate this investment agenda together. Thank you very much for your attention, and good luck for this inspiring conference.
Thank you very much. Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for setting the ambition there. It feels like we've got a casting deal with the European Investment Bank because a former employee that's risen through Bank of America Merrill Lynch, OECD Climate Change Unit, UNFCCC, Martin Berg is our moderator of the next panel. He is Chief Investment Officer of Climate Asset Management, and he's going to introduce his panel on how do we take it from here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and thanks for inviting me here. Maybe the speakers can already come to the panel, and then introduce them. I hope we have the other speakers online.
They should be coming up. There we go.
Okay, perfect. It's always amazing how it works. So yeah, so my name is Martin. I work for a company that is entirely focused on providing investment opportunities for large-scale investors and corporates into nature. So obviously this is a topic that is dear to my heart here. I think we also heard a lot already this morning, the role that the private sector is playing. So we want to turn this around and perhaps bring a little bit the perspectives from some private sector players or some observers that are seeing how the private sector could be engaged. And I think what we always find out, often they're looking at things a little bit differently. Or the private sector looks at things a bit different. We already heard kind of the underlying kind of data, kind of the return focus. So we want to drill into this a little bit. So and asking some of the key questions here. So why is this becoming more important for the private sector? What is actually the private sector actually doing? How is the private sector looking at the whole topic of biodiversity of nature? And then also, I think the big elephant in the room, how can we avoid greenwashing on this topic as well? So I think it's very easy to talk about nature, but actually integrating into what we do is always a lot more difficult. So we will focus a little bit, and I hope you bear with me, because I think it's really important, a bit about the plumbing. So in a way, so kind of what's really, I would call it the plumbing for biodiversity and for nature finance, because that is really important, because that's how the private sector is looking at it. And we will talk about, hopefully not things that are new task forces are being developed, but we'll introduce this a little bit through the panel. Yeah, so but with that, I would really like to introduce my panel. I think on the screen here we have Eric Usher, who heads up the UNEP Finance Initiative. We have Walid Lati, the head of Environment Transition and Resilience Division at the OECD. So welcome both of you virtually. Then we have Sophia Cheng, who is the Chief Investment Officer from Qatar Financial Holdings in Taiwan. And we have Mark Napier, who is the CEO of FSDF Africa. I think we'll give all of you a chance to introduce a little bit in your first question what we do. But you see, we have some people that are coming more observing what kind of are the policies to integrate the private sector, and then at the same time we have some practitioners here, and I really look forward to the input. So maybe we start with you, Eric. And firstly, I think it would be really great to explain what your organization is doing on this. But then, many observers are telling us that nature is the next big thing. There are articles out there that saying is nature the next big climate. So the question to you is really, how can we have the same public-private alignment in biodiversity that we have seen in climate to meet global goals? Over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Martin, and happy to be with you, although I'm sorry it's only in virtual form this time. So UNEP-FI, we actually are celebrating our 30th anniversary. We were established at the time of the Rio Earth Summit. So we've been around for quite a long time, and the sustainable finance space, certainly it's come to maturation to some extent, particularly in last couple of years. We work under the UN frameworks of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, Principles for Sustainable Insurance, and most recently the Principles for Sustainable Banking, or Responsible Banking, excuse me, the PRB. And then we are also convening a number of the GFANZ alliances, including some of the bigger ones, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, the Asset Owner Alliance, the Insurance Alliance. And so climate is probably the biggest issue of the day. However, we also work a lot on in other areas, including nature, biodiversity loss, and also stretching into resource efficiency, social issues, and the like. But so let me, in terms of to your question, Martin, let me step back a little bit. A little bit to the basics. Carbon in our atmosphere is the balance of greenhouse gas emissions and the sequestration of carbon via nature. And so, while the net zero debate, has so far been really laser focused on emissions, which indeed really matters, this is only half of the net zero ledger. And so, thousands of companies and financial institutions have already committed to net zero transition, but I think really only a handful of these really fully grasp the opportunities presented by and the role of nature in getting there. And frankly, it's mathematically impossible to fully decarbonize without nature. We are actively undermining the path to zero by only focusing on the emissions side. The faster we lose ecosystems with their, really their powerful sequestration benefits, the deeper the transition we need across energy, across transportation, and all other emitting sectors. Credible science tells us, about 37% of solutions to the Paris Agreement can come from nature. If we act now, we have a strong set of tools, nature-based solutions in our arsenal. If we delay the action until after 2030, then that number drops to 33%. Then it drops to 22% after 2050. So the more we degrade the nature around us, the less ability we have to actually address the climate crisis. President Hoyer pulled out some of the numbers, and I think many are kind of familiar with the scale and the reality that the capital mobilization towards nature-based solutions is not sufficient. And it's the private sector who's playing a very minor role. To our analysis, about 14% of financing today for nature-based solutions is private, the rest being public. This is despite the fact that the real economy depends so much on the services provided by nature. Although it's so critical to get to net zero attainment, nature is a new and emerging topic, and we need to be driving it forward, raising awareness, and we need to be understanding what are the tools, the products, the services that can help deliver nature-based solutions as a contribution to climate and more widely. I'll stop at that.
Very good. Thank you very much, Eric. And I think that was a great segue also to hand over to Wadid. As you probably all know, the OECD is doing a lot of ground research on all policy topics, including also biodiversity. So maybe you can continue the thought here and tell us a bit like what your research and what your kind of interaction with the private sector was, and in particular, what are the key priorities for the financial sector to better assess and manage biodiversity-related financial risks? Over to you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to answer this key question. But let me first say that the business and the economic case for action on biodiversity is clear, as the OECD stressed to the G7 in 2019 and 2021. The good news is we are witnessing a momentum and increased awareness towards biodiversity by the financial sector in the past 3 years, in the lead up to CBD COP15. The launch of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, for instance, is a welcome step, and the OECD is pleased to participate as a knowledge partner. Coming back to your question, I can see here three priorities. First, financial market participants need to start assessing biodiversity-related impacts, dependencies, and risks. Several measurements approaches are available for financial actors to better assess biodiversity impacts and dependencies, despite limitations with existing metrics. Second priority is more work is needed to improve modeling of risk and developing scenarios for projections in order to go beyond impacts and dependencies and include biodiversity in financial risk management. I can see also a third priority. Central banks and supervisors have an important role here to play to better assess and manage biodiversity-related financial risks. With respect to central bank operation, collateral frameworks, financial stability, and banking supervision. The OECD, we launched this month a 2-year project to develop a supervisory framework to help central banks and commercial banks access biodiversity-related financial risks. We will then implement this framework to the Hungarian financial system, working closely with the Central Bank of Hungary. I think given the complexity of nature-related risks, central banks may also wish to consider adopting a precautionary approach here. Thank you, Martin. Back to you.
No, thank you. And we said that we wanted to make it also as practical as possible. So maybe we can zoom in, Mark, with you and focus a little bit on the work you're doing in Africa. We all know Africa is in particular depending on nature. And so maybe you can help us a bit with some practical insights of your work. So what is happening and not happening around investments in nature with a focus on Africa?
Well, thank you. My name's Mark Naker. I run a large financial sector development program called FSD Africa. We're based in Nairobi. We have about 70 professionals working on basically building financial markets for a sustainable future on the continent. So we get stuff done on the ground. We're quite well rooted with the regulators and the private sector in those markets. Maybe just to pick on a number of specific practical things, Martin, I know you were asking for practical examples. Firstly, measurement. I think that's really key. Unless we have a baseline, we're not going to know whether what we're doing has any impact. And just to highlight, today we released an Africa landscape of climate finance, working with Climate Policy Initiative, which actually shines a light on what President Hoyer was saying about the relative roles of governments and the private sector and the MDBs and the climate funds. So it's well worth looking at that. Needless to say, the quantum of money going into climate finance is extremely low. We could all do with a lot more of that. The second thing is we're working on tools, the tools that the likes of UNEP or the likes of IUCN are developing in order to make it easier for investors to work out how to actually make an investment in a particular thing. Because at the moment, what's missing is data, and the data to explain whether something actually leads to any impact at all, and if so, how that impacts flows. And I think without those data pieces resolved, I think it's going to be very difficult to see investment flowing. So what we're doing at FSD Africa is trying to look at these various tools, trying to work out what's going to work, trying to scale up pilots, and give more space to the ones that look most promising. The third is the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures. We are pursuing a big exercise there, working with Vivid, McKinsey, but also with Oliver Wyman on piloting, well, firstly on quantifying the risks and opportunities for financial institutions in Africa that come from their exposure to nature. It's pretty groundbreaking stuff to try and actually quantify what the risks and opportunities are, and I would certainly recommend that you look at our website for that. Part of that we included setting up something called the African Natural Capital Alliance, which is financial institutions and other interested stakeholders who are going to be the standard bearers, the torch holders for natural capital in Africa. And we're also piloting in depth with 6 large financial institutions, 2 asset managers, 4 banks, how you might actually do a TNFD disclosure framework, which I think is good. The fourth thing I wanted to talk about is public debt market, so government debt. And the point that Werner Hoyer was making about the role of the private sector, we can all agree very much that the private sector is highly underinvested in this area. But the reality is government needs to play too, especially around adaptation finance and nature because of the PPP nature of nature. And so the problem we have in most countries in Africa is the lack of fiscal space. And so unless you can create more fiscal space through innovative funding arrangements, very nice to hear the Seychelles example, we need so many more examples of that. Interesting this week to hear about Barbados, to hear about Uruguay. This is really exciting, but we're not seeing nearly enough of that happening in Africa yet. Because we have to get governments to play their role, and so we're looking forward to that. And then the final point is carbon market development, which everybody's talking about in great detail. We are playing heavily in that space. We've actually invested real money in that. We are interested particularly in getting sort of the small guys into the game. So we've actually invested in a platform that will allow the motorbike taxi drivers to switch into EVs, the tree planters, the irrigation scheme, the solar irrigation pumps, so that they can also benefit from carbon finance as well. So it's a multi-pronged approach. There's a lot going on. I'm sure, sometimes, like most people in this room, I'm sure sometimes we feel quite bleak about the challenge. I'm generally speaking a positive sort of person, and I just know there's a lot going on. There isn't enough, but we're on the way.
It's really encouraging to hear, particularly that there's so much activity in Africa. We're moving a bit further east to Sophia. Your firm, Cathay Financial Holding, you're one of the pioneers on climate. When you now hear this, when you look at biodiversity or nature, how do you look at this? Are you seeing this as a risk, as an opportunity? Is this even on your radar as an investor?
I often don't like to think about risk and opportunity. If it's something we should do, think about how to do it first. And usually I don't take constraint of resource as a reason not to do it. If it's something important, we do it, and we add filters, evaluating resource, and who do we have people, do we have money, that's the last step. And then based on the resource constraint, we can start to define the boundary, the scope. So I like to encourage everyone, think about the possibility first. And that, of course, later will include risk and opportunity. My name is Sophia Cheng. I'm the Chief Investment Officer of Cathay Financial Holdings. It's the largest financial group in Taiwan. We have assets around $400 billion US. We service 60% of population in Taiwan. Biggest life insurance, biggest asset manager, second largest P&C insurance. And we were very fortunate because we were also listed companies. So investors will be asking us about our ESG, responsible investments, Scope 3, net zero TCFD. So I lead the responsible investment team. So far we have been very honored to participate in many global initiatives. We are the only Taiwan financial group in Climate Action 100+, and very honored to share all the targets in Taiwan and additional 5 companies. We made them commit to net zero. We have got approved by SBT, and we joined E100, and we also have just joined TNFD. The best way is to learn by participating in global initiative. We have the knowledge sharing. We know why it is important, and we can all do our effort, think about how can that localize back to Asia or back to Taiwan. So we are very famous for our engagement. And I also find the beauty of engagement is that often I found investors will be a little bit too arrogant. They will go to the corporate saying, we represent this much of assets. But we think corporate care about their future more than us. So we will share with them, thank you for the opportunity. We can share with you the global trends, and we come with very good intention. And I found that works very well in Asia, where corporate, they feel they are informed, they are engaged, and they are respected. So they always run at much faster speed than we thought. Today, 2 years ago, when I was deciding the series valuing water finance initiative versus diversity, I chose water first because I think biodiversity is so wide. It's so easy for corporate to pick a small project and write a big story on their CSR report. To me, that's greenwashing. And so I think as asset manager, we should all kick out the greenwashing and ESG washing. But today, I think the timing is much better with the experience from engagement on climate, social issues, the framework for TCFD. And we said now you can benchmark and learn how to design a framework. I can see TNFD, the current framework, it's quite well, can be better understood by corporates. I also start to see related to TNFD on the simulation toolkits. The analysis toolkit is available, so it's a waste if we don't try to start to work on nature. I also found the scholars, scientists feel so lonely. They now have the opportunity. In my whole life, I have never seen scientists so willing to make their work available for commercial world. And in my whole life, I have never seen corporates, investors, everyone are required to use science-based methodology and to apply that. And we are very keen. You can see the momentum after people learn the beauty of that, they start to make a commitment. So biodiversity is bigger and even more important than climate. Climate is part of the important, easier to understand area where without biodiversity, we don't have future. We all depend on nature. And humanity, the ecological footprint, we are consuming 1.5 times of how fast the biocapacity can recover itself. So this is a very simple math. If we don't do something, we will just ruin our future. Today, we have 84 countries representing 74% of world's greenhouse gas emission. They communicate about net zero and carbon neutral, where in Asia, we have 15 countries already. 2 countries already put it in law, more are coming. So including Taiwan, where I come from, we have government has already announced net zero pathway with the initial sectors which link to CBAM in EU and the carbon border tax. Yeah, so there is a very fast momentum in Asia talking about how to do low carbon transition. And I think despite biodiversity globally may be an early stage on how to do it, but it's a natural belief. We all like to go to nature. And so try to start with where my core competence could be related to, and try to welcome all the visitors when their project come. As a financial institution, we can pick the projects which are meaningful. Even today, if we don't think they are qualified in future bad debt loss, investment return, at least spend time helping them to become bankable and investable, because they do need help. A lot of project designers, they actually don't understand the mindset of investor and banks. So with our education, helping them to know that the world can really create more bankable and investable projects. Yeah, so, and someone mentioned about PPP, public-private partnership. In Europe, it's already very popular, the so-called blended finance. EIB, development banks, development funds are so willing to give up their interest to you and so willing to provide credit enhancement. It is so important for potential industry experts, the big companies and financial institutions, spend some resource to learn where are they, who needs help, especially in emerging markets. So with this credit enhancement and the concessional projects, this will try to enhance commercial terms. The time is quite urgent, so I really hope all the financial institutions can think about whether we can go beyond the traditional way we run a bank, just on collateral, cash flow. Can we think about something beyond the traditional banking? Today, we are trying so much effort to please Microsoft, Apple, TSMC, begging them to borrow money, where we don't want to spend some time to think about how to make this small company become a great company in the future. All the great companies start with the SME. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do together.
No, thank you very much, Maria. I'm looking at Peter here now, who disappeared, whether there's some questions from the audience. If not, I think there was a lot to unpack. And I think the one thing we heard now a lot was the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. And I'm not sure whether everybody's really here familiar. We always kind of assume that. Eric, could you kind of give us a bit, like you've been involved from the beginning, maybe you and Wally can give us a bit of a crash course. What is this actually? Why is this so important? And what could it actually bring for private sector engagement?
Sure, and I think most people, when they start to explain the TNFD, they start with the TCFD, because I think the trajectory of the TCFD has been very important in the climate space, and we have high hopes that TNFD will follow much of that. TCFD was initiated actually by the French presidency at the time of the Paris COP. But it was Mike Bloomberg who was asked to put together a set of private sector representatives to give recommendations on how corporates should start to disclose on climate risks. It's G20, which meant it was voluntary. And so for the first 3-4 years, you start to get an increasing uptake on a voluntary basis. We believe it's very important that these developments start in the voluntary sphere, because it's up to the private sector really who has the expertise about how do we deal with these challenging issues. And importantly, we've gotten to quite a good breadth of disclosure on TCFD, but the depth, the quality of disclosures are sometimes wanting. And this is where the regulators have then started to step up. Started in New Zealand, EU, UK, many places, including the SEC in the US now, looking to say, okay, how can we start to now mandate disclosures so we can improve the quality, the comparability. But it's been a very important development in the climate space. On the back of that, we and three other organizations worked together for some time to prepare the ground to launch a similar task force, a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, TNFD. It has a similar structure. It is private sector who is mostly on the task force. However, it has an interesting public-private structure in terms of the co-chairs. One is Elizabeth Marema, who heads the Convention on Biological Diversity, so sort of representing the public sector and essentially the negotiations between governments around the global biodiversity framework. And the other co-chair is David Craig, the former CEO of Refinitiv. And so you have a good, I think, relationship there in terms of chairs, and then a very depth of expertise within the task force itself. It has been putting out rounds of different stages or beta versions of the framework. It's been receiving a lot of feedback, different actors. We heard from Mark in Africa efforts, and we are, UNEP-FI, we're working in many regions about how do we start to pilot these disclosures. I think one of the obvious things is in many ways, nature is more complicated than simply carbon, at least from a mitigation side, and therefore how you disclose on nature risks in many ways can be very challenging. And so we really need the power, the knowledge of the private sector to lean in and to basically say, this is how we believe it should be done. We need a very open, transparent process to essentially be providing feedback, testing out, making improvements, and through that we hope to actually start to have a good, solid framework so that it starts to become I don't want to call it second nature, but very understood about the need to start disclosing on these risks. Of course, final word is the ISSB, under the IFRS Foundation, the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is also just getting started, and we would hope over time will be the place that the TCFD, the TNFD, other frameworks essentially get absorbed into in one way or another, so that corporates essentially will start to understand the need to start disclosing on sustainability impacts, is what we call the inside-out perspective, and that becomes just a common understanding that that's what you do, and then you need to understand what those impacts have to do with your business, how you can shift them around to create positive impacts, how can we create positive outcomes, positive prosperity, which at the end is going to be positive for the bottom line.
Yeah, I think in particular for many corporates on the climate side, the TCFD was really an eye-opener what type of risks they had sitting in their balance sheet and their portfolios. And so the question is whether this will be the same on nature. And maybe Mark, because you've been working on some more concrete studies, can you just give us a bit insight? What does it concretely? I mean, this is all very theoretical now, right? So what does it actually, in a practical basis, mean when you work with the 6 African kind of financial institutions? What are they looking at?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what the methodology is really to apply the TNFD LEAP framework. For those of you who are interested in the detail of that, I suggest you go to TNFD. We don't have enough time to go into all of that detail here, but essentially to look at dependencies, to look at risks, and really to start to tell a story about how your strategy needs to evolve in order to accommodate risks and opportunities, so that your investors or other stakeholders who are interested in you can understand where you relate, how you relate to nature. One of the things just coming through from the work in Africa is just the huge positivity of those institutions who we're working with around this topic. And I think we have to remember that in Africa, the psychology is very much, climate, we didn't create the problem. But actually, we do know about nature. We really know about nature. Our natural assets are very valuable to us. We're very exposed to the agricultural sector and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of interest from those institutions who are participating, but also a lot of head scratching as well, and because they're also realizing it's extremely complicated. So one of the key learnings is they really like the opportunity to come together in a peer group, to be supported. It's also easier for them to move together as a block rather than for one institution to stick their neck out and say this is really important, because that's not so good either, because people criticize them for doing that. So that's a really important insight. And another really important insight is around regulation. And I'm not sure I disagree with what Eric's saying, but I do think, I hope that we can move more quickly into a regulated environment with TNFD than we did with TCFD, simply because I don't think we've got the time to work it out in a very voluntary environment for something as complicated as this. And so some of the feedback that we're getting from the institutions is, wow, this is all really big. Can we do a light version and sort of start with that? And can the regulators sort of give us guide rails on how we should really apply that light version? And then we'll do it, rather than sort of have to deal with the complexity of the whole thing. And I think it's just really, really important. They need guidance. It's not about saying, we don't really want to do it, we'll only do it if we have to. It's also just about the clarity of the guidance they get from the regulators as well. So those are some of the key learnings that we're getting from it. But it's a very, very, it's a very positive bit of feedback that we're getting from the market at the moment. And I think people are actually very interested to learn more. I've said this before, but in Africa, if we'd started 20 years ago or 15 years ago on nature rather than on climate, I think we might have made much more progress on climate if we'd done it the other way around, if you see what I'm saying. So, because it just feels much more tangible to our stakeholders in that continent.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry, one thing to say, just on the regulatory point, I do think it's very important to distinguish between the banking sector and the capital markets as well. And I feel, the banks, just talking to colleagues earlier, I think the banks are able to probably adapt and shimmy, but the capital market players, the asset managers, the insurance companies who are in it long term, those are the guys who I think we need to really get to. And I think it's the capital market regulators, so I think we collectively need to work on quite hard to generate a little bit more enthusiasm around the topic.
Okay, perfect. I think we wanted to open it up to some questions. I'm just looking here at the organizer. Peter, is there still some time, or do we need to wrap it up? Because I think now would be a good time.
You've got time for another question. I've got one from the audience, if you like.
Sure.
You ask one more, and then I'll get the question from the audience.
Perfect. I just want to come back to you, and we have to be really short, Sophia, because we want to get some of them. But when you hear this now, again, you're doing TCFD reporting, and you're probably looking at some of the, yeah. What is your expectation? What will it do to and maybe not just for your company, but in general? What do you think to the private sector? Will we see the same? So what I've observed is that a lot of organizations that looked into their climate risk understood what they had for risk in there, and then from a sudden they also looked, okay, I have to actually change something. And the moment there's a risk, usually the financial market also looks for an opportunity. Do you think we have the same on nature?
Of course. Try not to make past 20 years experience to prevent you from imagining next 20 years. Corporate always start with it's hard, but actually if they must do, they will do a very good job. So I think because in this year, CDB, the Carbon Disclosure Project, in the questionnaire, they already add biodiversity-related questions. So I'm very sure next year, everyone will prepare a very good set. Then that made me start to worry about greenwashing. And it's very important, if you make it easy for corporate to understand, they will tell you net zero, all these are difficult. Nothing is easy in life. And bear in mind, in the past 5-6 decades, people are earning the money, showing us very good return on equity because they throw the responsibility, the cost to social and environment. So the real good business leader, they will understand those extra money is no longer there. So it's not a decision or to do or not to do. It's rather than if you do it, you can capture the future world. So as long as we make corporate understand to know this, otherwise they will feel very overwhelmed. So I will do tailored communication kit for every company I engage, speaking for their benefit to do that. And so if we can think about what needs help and who can collaborate together, and can we have a volunteer network? For example, if I will assume if you guys can, this organization can put the metrics, and these are the things we need to do in what region, and we can raise a hand, I'm happy to do this part. Rather than corporate thinking, we focus on our core competence. I happen to work in financial industry doesn't mean I cannot love nature. So I think having a roadmap telling people should do things that the world needs rather than the things I want to present for marketing purpose. And lastly, if there's any asset manager here, we should put ESG, climate, and nature as part of our evaluation when we choose an asset manager. We need to bear in mind that we are not required to make return with impact. We manage money on our clients' behalf. And therefore, ideally, I really hope we have the mission. We earn the return for them, at the meantime, earn their respect.
Thank you, Sophia.
So from the online audience, we've got some pieces coming through that are sort of slightly contradictory for you to unpack for us. But I just want to ask the question to the in-person audience, so we've just got the same show of hands. Excuse me, asked online was, how should we look at biodiversity to mobilize the financial sector, either as a risk or an opportunity? What's the best way to move the finance sector? So, show of hands, moving them by opportunity. Okay. Moving them by risk. There we go. And there's some people in the middle, or people that are tired. So we had nobody tired in online. That looked like 2/3, 1/3. Do you think? 2/3 opportunity, 1/3 risk. It's 77% online said present this as an opportunity to move the sector. 23% said as a risk. But then there's a question about stopping investors doing something, which I think links to a comment that I think I heard there when I was getting the questions about, I hope for a regulated market. I think that's what I heard. They said some investors who claim that they're stopping investing in fossil fuels do still invest in refineries, don't have it sort of out of their portfolios altogether. So how do we stop this and make investors only invest in nature-positive, non-polluting, climate-neutral companies? How can we sort of achieve that trifecta?
Okay, just Cathay alone, I have $400 billion US dollar asset. If you can find me $400 billion natural positive return and help the world, tomorrow we can sign a contract. So, but you can see the progress. In 2019, Cathay United Bank, we stopped doing any new loans to coal-fired power plant and the transportation, where for Cathay Life asset, we only invest in a company who are correlated, but they have ambition and transition. We want them to change their behavior. We don't want to kill them. Otherwise, no one will build this building, which consists of cement, steel, glass. Yeah, so education is the nature duty for investor. But if they don't care, of course, we should divest them. By moving toward those who care more, and by divesting away, this year I do start to feel bigger stress on strand asset, expanding from just coal to overall fossil. The second point is some countries, they depend on energy import. Taiwan, we import 90% of our energy. So to me, I would take coal first, and I'll wait for government to move to gasoline while preparing for the next generation, because you see many climate tech is emerging. So every country, the learning curve, removing away the dislike parts, every country is different. Korea and Japan have similar situation, where in Southeast Asia, some countries have very good abundant hydro power available. So I think it's country by country. We need to do deep analysis. We need to respect the constraint. At the meantime, find solution. Once they see the solution, they have no excuse not to do something.
Thank you. I think Mark was
Yeah,
nudging
just
me as well.
a super quick point. I think the work that we've been doing shows that it's not all about wholesale reinvention, right? So it can be very scary for financial institutions to imagine they're going to have to completely change the way they do things. It's not actually. It's about adaptation, because within sectors there are still sectors that are important to you. Agriculture, well, just pivot towards part of the agricultural sector that is pro-nature rather than the ones that are not. So I think our message would be to say, just get involved, start to unpack it for yourselves and start to interpret how it really affects you as an institution, and then make those adaptive changes. It's not perhaps as scary as you might think.
But we need to accelerate. Time is running out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone?
Yes, can I just say a few things? That's very important, the question regarding the shift from fossil fuel investment to nature-positive investment. I think there's three criteria here, is how we de-risk, how we make the return enough incentives and third, the predictability. And through the three criteria, we see clearly the role of public policies. Incentivize private investment can go through more active public policy. And here I would like to showcase important that all biodiversity relevant taxes, fees, payment for ecosystem services and other economic instruments are really underutilized. Biodiversity relevant tax, for instance, the revenue are amount around 0.9% of the revenue generated by all environmental related tax in all OECD countries, which is in turn account for 5% of the total tax revenue, which is nothing actually when you compare with all the support that we give to environmental harmful subsidies in OECD countries.
Just to push the point forward from the people online, and they might be in the room as well, but just this idea of nudging and pivoting and accelerating, and there's not a 400 billion left yet for me to move it all at once to the right spot. Are there a regulation as a sort of a fast follower? Like there's stuff that goes out ahead that proves the model, that proves you can make money. Is there any sort of beacons out there that anyone here admires and says that nature positive portfolio or that instrument is actually leading the way in terms of returns and investments, impacts on the ground that are positive? Is there places that regulators and the mainstream could look for inspiration out ahead?
I'm happy actually to jump in.
Perfect.
I actually think disclosure is really important.
Which one?
Disclosure, right?
Yeah.
So which basically means looking at the risks. So I have to say, we've seen under the whole climate experience that people look first at the risks, then at the opportunities. If you just present no opportunities, you're running into you're not running into open moors that were saying, oh, what is this new field? But if you're saying, look, you have actually a significant risk here on your balance sheet and we have to change something, this changes. And I think this goes, the example I would always cite is that the French government now has an obligation not only to disclose the risks related to climate, but also to biodiversity. And I can, from my personal kind of experience from speaking to investors, we see that makes a huge difference in the engagement. From a sudden, CEOs of big insurance companies are interested in biodiversity. They have to report on the risk, they want to understand it. And the first question they're asking, if this is a risk, where's the opportunity and what can we actually do? How can we come to nature positive investment? So I would not, I mean, it's boring to talk about disclosure and to kind of all these things, but I actually think what we've seen on the climate side, this has driven real change, and I hope that the same will be done on nature.
Yeah.
I'd like to echo that. I don't think government should do micromanagement, but government should encourage proper disclosure framework and asking corporate to make quantified target. And then so some company will tell me about 200 work they have done on ESG and climate, and I always come back to a question, okay, does that mean you can cut 20% emission by 2030? Yeah, so having quantified target, and if you join IE100 SBT, if you are SDGs and Paris aligned, that means you need to go net zero by 2050. So just constantly asking them, what do you do and how much you buy, how many animal species you have preserved? Can you give me quantify? So asking for disclosure framework, and from large corporate to mid to small companies. And if they can do carbon footprinting, they can do a lot more footprinting and many things.
Mark, but I think you disagree a little bit with that approach, right? I mean, we had this discussion before when we kind of planned this panel, and we felt very strongly that actually regulation is probably really required.
No, I do. Yeah, I'm sorry, and it's because I believe that risk is what drives these institutions. Because I'm agreeing with you. I do think it's really, really important. I mean, I'm sort of saying, in a way, I agree with you, Sophia, which is that we need the framework. But I just think, and I'm speaking particularly from an African perspective here, which is, and capacity is extremely weak. People just, they don't have the capacity to be able to get into all the complexity. And so I think they do need very clear guidance. And there is obviously an ideological issue about financial sector firms preferring to be allowed to work things out for themselves. But the thing is they have so much more capacity than governments, right? That I think we just need to kind of push them on that road. I really do believe that.
I think we are the same. Taiwan government has required a company at different paying capital. They need to disclose based on TCFD framework. They need to show the simulation scenarios result. They need to have a proper plan and set the target and the number of the target. At the meantime, I think government definitely need to set that net zero progress. They need to manage that the net zero pathway.
Sorry,
yeah,
Sophia,
that's
but
required.
I mean, disclosure also in the sense is going to be an incentive as well in the future, so you can regulate. But it's also at some point, companies don't want to be the ones who are holding back. They want to be seen to be at the front of the pack. And so the stories of the great things they're doing and so on. So we need to get into that psychology as well. Yeah.
Great. It sounds like if we had an and option on the opportunity and risk, that would have won the poll. Do you want to close out the panel? Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much. Thanks to the panelists. I think what my hope will be that we are probably next year a bit more concrete what it actually means, that more companies are saying, yes, it's not that we may focus on nature, but that nature is really on their forefront, and that we'll then really talk about the opportunities much more in detail next time.
Fantastic.
So thank you very much, and thank you to the panel.
Round of applause to the panel. Thanks for joining us.